Margaret had been waiting all week for this day. From the porch of her cozy Vermont home, she could see the fields stretching out before her, glowing gold beneath the soft touch of autumn. She had laid out her finest china, polished until it gleamed in the afternoon light, baked Daniel's favorite apple pie, and filled a vase with fresh-cut wildflowers from the garden. Her grandson was finally coming home from college, and her heart had been quietly counting the days, the hours, the minutes. She remembered the boy he used to be, the one who ran barefoot through these same fields, laughing with the wind at his back and chasing fireflies until the evening fell. She could still hear his laughter echoing faintly in her memory, still see the way his hair caught the sun. In her mind, he was always that boy, bright-eyed and curious, always asking questions, always hungry to learn. But when the car pulled into the driveway and Daniel stepped out, something inside her shifted. A tremor of recognition mixed with something she couldn't quite name. He looked older, of course, broader shoulders, taller frame, a quiet confidence in the way he carried himself. College did that to young men, yet this change felt deeper. His eyes, once filled with unguarded light, now held a stillness, a kind of weight that didn't belong to someone his age. When he hugged her, it was warm, sincere, and strong, but different. Not the spontaneous, exuberant hug of a boy returning home, but the embrace of someone who had been away, not just in distance, but in life. "It's so good to see you, Grandma," he said softly, his voice calm but heavy with something unspoken. Through dinner that evening, Margaret watched him closely. She had made all his favorites, roasted chicken, her buttery rolls, that perfect pie, but conversation didn't flow the way it once had. Daniel spoke politely, always gentle, but with a pause before each sentence, as if measuring what to say. His gaze often drifted toward the window, drawn to the darkening fields outside. It was as though the quiet beyond the glass held more of his attention than the warm light of home. Margaret kept her smile bright, laughed in all the right places, filled the silences when he would not. But her heart stirred with questions she couldn't ask. Something in him had changed, and she could feel it as clearly as the chill in the autumn air. After dinner, Daniel excused himself earlier than she expected. He said the trip had been long, that he needed rest. She watched him climb the stairs, his figure disappearing into the soft shadows of the hallway. Then she sat alone at the table, her fingers tracing the edge of her teacup, her thoughts restless. The last time she had seen him, he was all energy and optimism, excited for the new world awaiting him at college. That Daniel had been full of light. Tonight's Daniel, quiet, reflective, almost distant, felt like someone entirely new. It wasn't wrong, just different, and the difference unsettled her in ways she couldn't explain. The next morning dawned crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. Margaret wrapped her hands around a warm cup of tea and settled into her chair on the porch. Daniel joined her soon after, moving with an easy, deliberate calm. He smiled. A faint, polite smile. But behind it was a quiet that spoke louder than words. She wanted to ask him the question pressing against her heart. "What happened to you, my dear boy?" But instead, she kept her voice light. "How are your classes? Your friends? College treating you well?" He answered each question, but only briefly. His words were careful, guarded. And when his eyes met hers, she saw it again. That distant look, that quiet ache. It wasn't just tiredness. It was something deeper, something that lingered behind the surface. Margaret had lived long enough to recognize it. Life had a way of etching itself into people, of leaving quiet marks invisible to most. She could sense that Daniel carried something he wasn't ready to name. And so she decided not to press, not yet. She would wait, watch, and be ready when the time came. But all through the day, her mind kept circling back to one silent question. What has changed my grandson so deeply? By evening, she found him in the living room. The soft lamplight fell over him as he stood beside the old piano, his fingers gliding across the keys without pressing them down, as though testing their memory. He didn't play at first, just traced them gently, like the music inside him was too heavy to release. Margaret stood quietly at the doorway, her heart tender with love and worry. She realized in that moment the truth she had been avoiding. Daniel had grown into a man. And men, she knew, carried their own stories, their own quiet battles, their own heartbreaks. That night, she lay awake, listening to the creak of the old house and the wind rustling through the trees. Her thoughts circled around the same image, Daniel's eyes, filled with both depth and distance. It reminded her of another time, another man, his father, returning home from the army with that same look. Older than his years, his silence full of things too heavy to tell. Life had marked him then, and now somehow it had marked Daniel too. The next morning, sunlight spilled across Margaret's garden, bathing the rows of late-blooming flowers in gold. She was kneeling in the dirt, pulling up weeds when she heard footsteps. Daniel came toward her, hands tucked into his pockets, gaze fixed on the horizon instead of the earth. His movements were slower than she remembered, as though each step carried thoughts that wouldn't let him go. Margaret straightened, wiped her hands on her apron, and smiled at him, though concern flickered quietly in her eyes. "Daniel," she said softly, "is something troubling you?" He gave her a small, practiced smile, the kind that was meant to reassure but didn't quite reach the eyes. "I'll tell you soon, Grandma," he said after a pause. "I promise." His words were gentle but restrained, as if he were afraid of letting something spill before its time. Margaret didn't push. She had learned over many years that silence sometimes carried more truth than words. She nodded, turned back to her garden, and let the quiet stretch between them. But her heart ached. She could feel the longing beneath his calm, the sense that part of him was still somewhere else. The day passed in simple rhythms. Shared lunch, light conversation about classes, books, weather, but every exchange circled back to silence. Every pause seemed filled with the things Daniel wasn't saying, and each time she caught him staring toward the fields, she wondered what memory was pulling him there. That evening, as twilight deepened, Margaret was in the kitchen rinsing dishes when she heard the faint sound of piano notes drifting through the house. She dried her hands quickly and followed the music to the living room. Daniel sat at the piano, his shoulders slightly hunched, his fingers moving slowly across the keys. He wasn't playing one of the bright, lively songs from his childhood. This melody was different, soft, deliberate, almost like a confession. The tune held weight, sorrow, yearning, the kind of sound that speaks when words refuse to come. Margaret stood by the doorway, her heart stilling. She had never heard him play like that before. It wasn't just music, it was emotion poured out in sound. Every note felt like a secret unraveling itself quietly in the room. She stepped closer. "Who taught you that song?" she asked gently. Daniel froze, his fingers hovering above the keys. For a long moment he said nothing. Then slowly he looked up at her, and in that single look, one filled with memory, tenderness, and pain, Margaret understood. "She did," he whispered. The words were barely audible, but they carried the weight of his heart. Margaret felt her chest tighten. She didn't need to ask who she was. She already knew. It wasn't hard to see now. The reason behind his silence, his faraway gaze, his quiet transformation. He had known love, and perhaps loss. The space between them filled with quiet understanding. She rested her hand on his shoulder, warm and steady. She didn't speak, didn't question, didn't intrude. She simply stood there beside him, letting him know she was there, that when he was ready to tell his story, she would be listening. Later that night, long after Daniel had gone upstairs, Margaret sat by the window, the moonlight silvering her hair. The garden outside glowed faintly under the stars. She thought of her own youth, of first love, and the ache that followed it, the way it could both fill and hollow a person at once. She saw that same look now in Daniel's eyes, and she smiled sadly to herself. "So," she whispered into the stillness, "it's love." And in that soft admission, she understood completely. The change in her grandson was no mystery at all. It was love's doing, the oldest story in the world, quietly writing itself anew in him. Mark, the kind that makes a person see the world differently, the kind that stays even when words cannot. She didn't know her name. She didn't know Thestery, but she knew one thing for certain. Soon Daniel would tell her everything. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. Margaret knelt in her garden, tugging at stubborn weeds between the rows of moms when she sensed Daniel behind her. He wasn't rushing like he used to, bounding outside with the energy of a boy. Instead, he walked slowly, his hands buried in his pockets, gaze fixed on the faraway hills as though they held some secret he couldn't share. Margaret stood and brushed her hands on her apron, smiling at him. "Daniel," she said gently, "is something troubling you?" He looked at her, and the corners of his mouth lifted in a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'll tell you soon, Grandma. I promise." The promise sounded heavy, not light, and Margaret's heart tightened. She didn't press him. Life had taught her when silence was more important than questions. She simply nodded and turned back to her flowers, though her thoughts stayed on the unspoken words caught between them. The rest of the day unfolded slowly. They ate lunch together, her roasted chicken and fresh rolls, but Daniel barely touched his plate. He answered her questions politely, speaking of classes and the weather, but every answer was clipped, guarded, as though he feared letting too much slip. Again and again, Margaret caught him staring toward the distance, lost in a place she could not follow. She wanted to reach across the table and ask, "Who is on your mind? What do you carry so quietly?" But she kept her peace. Evening crept in, and the house settled into its familiar quiet. Margaret washed dishes at the sink when the sound reached her. A soft, delicate thread of music drifting from the living room. She dried her hands quickly and followed it, her steps light, her heart curious. There was Daniel seated at the old upright piano, his shoulders sloped forward, his fingers moving with care, coaxing out a tune that was neither cheerful nor simple. It was tender, haunting, like a secret spoken only in notes. Margaret stood in the doorway listening, her breath caught in her chest. The melody wasn't practice. It was confession. She stepped closer, her voice no louder than a whisper. "Who taught you that song?" His hand stilled. For a long moment he didn't move, didn't look at her. Then slowly he raised his eyes. What she saw there made her chest ache, softness, sorrow, and a longing too deep for words. His lips parted and he answered with 2 quiet syllables. She did. Margaret didn't ask who. She didn't need to. The change she'd seen in him, the silence, the weight. It all made sense now. A she. A woman. Someone who had stirred his soul and left a mark so deep it showed in the way he walked. It's the way he spoke, the way he looked older than his ears. She moved to his side, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, and gave a small squeeze. She didn't press, didn't demand details. She only stood there, letting her touch tell him what words could not. "I understand. I'm here." That night, long after Daniel had gone upstairs, Margaret sat alone by the window. The moonlight spread across the garden, silvering the flowers, and she thought back to her own youth. She remembered what it felt like to carry love inside her chest, the soaring joy. It's the quiet ache, the way it made the world brighter and heavier all at once. Looking at the night sky, she whispered to herself, "So, that's it. It's love." And she knew then that the mystery was no mystery at all. Love had touched her grandson, and it had changed him. He wasn't ready to share everything, not yet. But Margaret felt certain of one thing. The truth would come soon, and when it did, it would be story of the heart. Margaret found herself waiting for Themament when Daniel would finally let goof whatever he was holding inside. She didn't push him, but she stayed close, patient, knowing the heart can't be rushed. That evening, she carried 2 cups of tea into the living room. Daniel was there again, his hands resting on the piano keys though he wasn't playing. His face was lost in thought, his eyes distant. She set the tea on the table and sat across from him, her voice soft but steady. "Daniel," she said, "tell me about her." He froze, his fingers tightening slightly on the keys. For a heartbeat, silence filled the room. Then his shoulders dropped and he turned toward her, his voice trembling, but sure. "Her name is Emily." Margaret leaned forward, her heart aching at the gentleness in his tone. Daniel's face lit with something fragile as he spoke. "She's everything, Grandma. She makes the world feel alive. But we come from different towns, different plans, different paths. Life pulled us apart before we could even understand what we were holding. I thought leaving for college would help me forget. I can't. She's everywhere in my mind. Margaret reached for his hand, her touch warm and steady. His words carried a weight she remembered well. She knew the sound of love when it lived inside someone's chest. Daniel's eyes grew glassy, his voice lowering. The last night before he left for college, she came to see me. She didn't say much, just looked at me with those eyes like she could see the future I didn't even know yet. And in that moment, I changed. I wasn't the same. That's why I look different to you, Grandma. It's because of her. Because she's still here with me, even when she's not. Margaret's chest tightened with emotion. She saw her own past reflected in his story. Once, long before she married his grandfather, she too had loved someone deeply, someone she couldn't keep. The memory of that lost tenderness returned like an old melody, and she felt the echo of her own longing as she looked at Daniel. She understood without needing more explanation. Daniel lowered his eyes, fingers brushing a few soft notes on the piano. I try to focus on school, on my future, but every song, every quiet moment takes me back to her. It's like part of me stayed behind with Emily. I don't know what to do. I don't even know if she feels the same anymore. But I can't let go. Margaret listened without interrupting, letting him spill what had been trapped inside for so long. She could see the storm beneath his calm face, the tug of love that was both beautiful and painful. She squeezed his hand, her voice filled with the wisdom of years. Daniel, love does this. It changes you. It leaves marks. It makes you see differently. It teaches you what matters. You're not weaker because of its jaws stronger, even if it hurts now. He looked at her, his eyes vulnerable. But what if I never see her again? What if she's already gone? Margaret's heart broke at the fear in his words. She knew that feeling too. The fear of losing someone without ever saying what needed to be said. She drew a deep breath and steadied herself. Then you'll carry her as part of who you are. But if she's still within reach, Daniel, don't let fear silence you. Love deserves to be spoken. Daniel's face softened, his jaw unclenching, though the ache was still there. For the first time since he had come home, the heaviness in him felt lighter. He leaned back against the piano bench, exhaling as though he had been holding his breath for months. Grandma, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You always know what to say. Margaret smiled gently, though inside she felt the sting of her own memories. She thought of the man she had once loved and lost, of how she had never spoken her heart before it was too late. That unspoken love had followed her all her life, hidden beneath the years surfacing now as she looked at her grandson. She didn't tell him her full story, but she let her silence speak. Daniel turned back to the keys, playing softly again, this time with less sorrow, more hope. Margaret sat quietly beside him, sipping her tea, listening as the melody filled the room. She knew this was only the beginning. He had spoken Emily's name, revealed his heart, and with that truth, the weight he carried would begin to shift. As the notes faded into silence, Margaret whispered, "She must be very special." Daniel nodded, his eyes shining with both pain and light. "She is." That night, when Margaret finally went tubed, she felt peace settle over her. Her grandson had opened the door to his heart, and though his journey was far from finished, he was no longer alone in carrying it. She prayed quietly that love would guide him, not crush him. She prayed that Emily, wherever she was, would hear the truth one day. Margaret knew love's power. It could wound, it could heal, it could define a lifetime. And as she drifted to sleep, she whispered into the darkness, "Hold on to her, Daniel. Don't let silence be the thief of your heart." The night after Daniel spoke Emily's name, the house felt different. Margaret could sense a shift in him, like the weight he carried was no longer pressing down quite as hard. She made breakfast early the next morning, scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee on, waited for him to come downstairs. When he finally appeared, his hair still messy from sleep, there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He sat across from her, eating quietly, but Margaret knew he was ready to say more. When the plates were cleared, she leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "Daniel, you've told me part of your heart, but what will you do now?" He hesitated, turning the coffee cup in his hands. "That's the part I don't know. I don't even know if Emily still thinks about me. What if I reach out and she doesn't feel the same?" His voice cracked with the fear of rejection, the kind that can paralyze even the bravest soul. Margaret reached across the table, placing her hand gently over his. Her ears were steady, carrying both love and wisdom. Daniel, love is always a risk, but silence is the heaviest burden of all. If she is in your heart, then she deserves to hear your truth. Don't let him steal your chance. For a long moment, Daniel didn't speak. Then, slowly, his shoulders relaxed and his face softened as if her words had broken through the wall he had built inside. "Grandma," he whispered, "I think I need to go find her." The words hung in there, fragile and brave at the same time. Margaret felt a swell of emotion. She'd waited years to hear words like these, not from herself, but from someone she loved. In Daniel's choice, she saw her own youth, her own regret, and the second chance she wished she had taken long ago. She squeezed his hand, her eyes shining. "Then go. Don't wait until the years slip away. Love is worth it, even if it scares you." That afternoon, Daniel walked the garden with her, speaking more freely than he had in days. He talked about Emily's laughter, but the way she used to sit beside him under the old oak tree. About how she made the simplest moments feel unforgettable as he spoke. Margaret could see the boy she once knew mixed with the man he was becoming. His steps grew lighter, his smile easier, as if sharing his heart had set him free. As the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Margaret stood beside him on the porch. She looked at him with pride, knowing he had taken the first step toward becoming not just a man, but and unafraid of love. "Daniel," she said softly, "no matter what happens, this journey will shape you. Love always does, and you will never regret being honest about what your heart holds." Daniel looked at her then, eyes clear, his voice steady. "Thank you, Grandma. You've given me more than advice. You've given me courage." The next morning, our Margaret stood by the doorway as Daniel packed his bag. His movements were purposeful, not rushed, but filled with determination. He hugged her tightly, and this time the embrace was different. No longer heavy with silence, but filled with hope. "Promise me one thing," she said, holding on to him a moment longer. "What's that?" he asked. "Promise me you won't wait too long. Say the words while they still matter." "I promise," he said firmly. She watched him walk to the car, figure out by the rising sun. He turned back once, waving with a smile that made him look like both the boy she remembered and the man he was becoming. Margaret felt tears gather in her eyes, not of sorrow, but of bittersweet joy. She knew he was stepping into uncertainty, but it was the kind of uncertainty worth embracing. As the car pulled away, Margaret whispered into the autumn air, "Go find her, Daniel, and may love lead you home again." The wind stirred the leaves across the yard, carrying her words into the distance. She stood on the porch until the car was gone, her heart full of pride and memory. She thought of her own lost love, of the chance she had never taken, and she felt a strange peace. Perhaps she could not rewrite her past, but through Daniel, love would get another chance to speak. Inside the house, the piano sat quietly, its keys still echoing the song of longing Daniel had played. Margaret touched the wood gently, smiling to herself. She knew that when he returned, he would come back not only with stories, but with the strength of someone who had dared to follow his heart. And in that moment, she realized something simple yet profound. Love was not just for the young. Love's lessons lived in every generation, carried forward like a flame. Through Daniel, she felt that flame burning again, brighter than ever.